Hey. Welcome to episode 114 of the Live Your Fuck Yes Life podcast. I'm Amanda Catherine Loy. And for those of you who are new around here, which there are a lot of new people around these parts, because we've been getting some fun traction on social medias. And I'm so excited that so many new voices are here and also so many of the OGs, so many of you Patreons. It's just so nice. Do I call you Patreons or patrons for those of you who are in the Patreon? Still getting used to that since we started that this year, but I'm just so grateful to be here with all of you. And I've been getting so many requests to talk more extensively and openly about my own coming out experience, because I talked about it in the context of polyamory when I first came out on the podcast and publicly about being polyamorous this fall, or this last fall, in fall 2020. But I realized that I really haven't dug deep with you on the podcast in the context of my bisexuality. And I've been getting so many questions about what that looked like for me, especially as somebody who was only 28 when they came out as bi to themselves, let alone to the world. I came out to publicly to my friends, family, and to myself all at the same time, really. And it has been such a whirlwind. And I've been talking a lot about this with so many of you. And so many of you have questions about it and questions around the validity of bisexuality, which is a big topic in the queer community, and has been for a really long time. Questions around shame or not knowing, and all these major questions around, why it took me so long to own that for myself. Did poly play a role in that and all of that stuff? So we are opening and peeling back the curtain today. And I just wanted to imagine like we are pulling up a chair. If you're watching me on YouTube, hey, you can see my face. And you can also see this really fucking weird thing my hair is doing right now. I'm doing this now on YouTube as well. And also obviously via Spotify and all of the amazing Apple apps that you can download to watch this or listen to this episode on. But ever since I started the podcast, it's almost 3 years. We're almost at the 3-year anniversary next week. When we go live for the episode, we'll be pretty much on it, which is wild. But my intention has always been to create a space where it feels like we're having a candid conversation together over coffee, whether that's joined with a guest or just me and you, sitting back and thinking about these things. And it's always felt so weird not having you on the other side of it. So for one, I'm glad that y'all can actually see my face now if you're watching it on YouTube. But two, it's so nice to now have the Patreon and our private community via that, where we can really deep dive into all of these topics, where I can see your faces. We'll be doing some community Zooms in the future. So stay tuned for that. If you're not already a part of it, you can sign up super easily to become a patron over at patreon.com, patreon.com/live your fuck yes life. The U is not starred in that. Again, all of that's always in the show notes. But it's been so nice to see you slowly trickling in and get to know you all off of the social media platforms where I love spending time with you. And as y'all remember, I, not that long ago got banned on Instagram for a little bit for a reason that makes absolutely no sense, but the censorship is wild right now. And I'm all about creating uncensored content for you. That's what this podcast is all about. And that's who I am all about. And so I'm really stoked that we finally have a private and sex positive, inclusive space on the interwebs for all of the Live Your Fuck Yes Life community. Whether you are new to this and this is your first time listening to the podcast or watching me on YouTube, or you just found me on one of my many social media platforms, or you've been around these parts for a long time, it's really our place to come and hang. So I'm excited to see you in there if you're not already in, and for all of you amazing OG patrons, sending you so much love, and we'll see you in there to talk more in depth about this episode. But I really wanted to come on and talk about my journey through bisexuality, because while I am not an expert in sexuality, I am an expert in myself. And I also have been very deeply in the world of self-understanding and self-exploration for the last 5 years. It's what I do, and what I facilitate in everything that I do as a coach. And while sexuality is a component of it, I would argue that it's a really, really big component of it. And it's one that so many of us, especially in the time of quarantine, I think have been asking ourselves and questioning, for so long. Growing up, all that I ever felt like was valid when it came to sexuality was being straight or being gay. And I will say that that in and of itself, I know is a privilege, because I grew up in a really sex positive family, and honestly in a city and a country that was a lot more advanced when it came to sexuality as a whole. That's not true for everywhere, but growing up in Toronto, I often feel like when I moved to the US for college a little over 10 years ago, it was like, oh wow, like I feel like where the Americans are at in juxtaposition to where I felt like things were at growing up, and this is obviously just from my lens and my experience, it was night and day different. Like, the gay community was just like so celebrated in Toronto. And granted, it's a big city. I'm sure there's small cities in Canada where that wasn't true, but that's what my experience was. And, growing up doing theater, growing up, really, really surrounded by so many incredible humans who are out and proud, and just having that experience at such a young age, it was just like, oh yeah, you're either straight or you're gay, right? But the idea of being something in the middle was not something I really understood. And frankly, was something that I think often was depicted as not real or valid. And it still is, to a large degree. I think that's changing. And I'm so grateful to be seen by so many of you as a voice for part of that change. It's not something I never imagined would be real, for me or a part of my experience. But I think this really hit me over the head the last couple of months, between having so many of you reach out who identify as bisexual or think you might identify that way and are in a marriage to a man or have been in a long-term relationship with a man for a long time and are now questioning if you really are straight. That's been a really, really big thing in my DMs and my messages and all my social media platforms. And, that was a big part of my story, huge part of my story. So we're going to deep dive into that, because I've never really, really talked about my bisexuality on this platform. I have in ways, and I have, obviously like with guests and, coming out as poly, like I talk about my personal experiences in that space and what it was like to step into poly was in a lot of ways in tandem with me stepping into my bisexuality. So it's hard for me to separate the two, because that was my personal experience. But when I spent the last couple of months really thinking about my journey with my body and how that has related to my sexuality, and also in writing this incredible piece that I was asked to write with Love What Matters. I'll link it for you all in the show notes. I was so honored to be asked. It's an incredible platform with first person stories of, people who have stories that are inspiring. And, I really deep dove for the first time since honestly the process of writing my book in 2019 into myself from a writing standpoint. I'm always doing things like this, talking on the podcast or talking on other people's podcasts, doing videos, facilitating videos in our, Patreon community, and teaching and facilitating this way via Zoom. That's literally how I do almost everything that I do. In the container of, my Live Your Fuck Yes Life world. But writing outside of my poetry this year, I haven't really written about my story so much since writing the book. And as I was writing the book, I was still holding a lot of shame around my sexuality. And I started writing the book before I came out publicly. In fact, most of my book writing experience was done before I came out as bi. It was only, I want to say, a third of the book that I wrote after I had come out, and I was not out as poly at that point, even though I was out with my friends and family. But I wasn't out publicly. So there was just a lot of stuff I was working through internally around that component of my life while I was writing I Chopped Off My Tits, which, P.S., if you haven't read it and you're curious, I know a lot of you have been reaching out about that too. You can check it out in the show notes too, or just go to amandacatherineloy.com/book and snag your copy. But yeah, it's been a wild experience for me. And when I was looking back on the podcast episodes, I was like, okay, episode 100 is where I showcased, incredible humans who all have different coming out stories. And we celebrated Pride in such a beautiful way this year by showcasing these human stories. And I shared a little bit about my journey in there as well. But really, I didn't even really come out when I talked about, outside of saying, yeah, I think I'm bi. And like, that was really it. I didn't talk about how I got there or what that journey has been like. So we're going to unpack that today. You ready? Let's fucking go. So I genuinely feel like I was not able to really own the nuance of my sexuality for 3 big reasons. The first, and I think the most important reason, which is the one that I was talking about a little bit before, and the one that I think most of us probably can relate to, no matter how you identify, is that we have been, as a society, so programmed to step into the straight, heterosexual narrative. And that, a man and a woman get together, and that is how you find love. That is how you experience turn on. And that is how even you build security. I mean, think about what we've been programmed to, and really what I'm about to turn 30, and my parents are in their 60s, and their generation, grew up in the 50s. That's when they grew up. And so they have the experience of, the nuclear family, and that being this expected way of living, and having, this very picture perfect life that is, frankly, from my standpoint, I always think about it from the Jetsons. Did you ever watch that show? But I used to love that show as a kid, and it always makes me think of it, right? Because it's really how we were programmed, and so much capitalism is rooted in that, and honestly, so much intense sexism and rigidity is placed in that space, and it's something that I have always felt really naturally pulled away from when I get really to the root of myself. And it's also the thing that's been mirrored to me, right? Like, I grew up in a situation that looked a lot like that. I have a mom and a dad, who both went to work, and, it was all about security and love. And that was what I witnessed. And all of my close family members were the same. And I didn't see or experience other people who had different looking family structures. I didn't experience polyamorous families. I didn't experience, I didn't have any friends who had gay parents or anything of that nature. Certainly not outwardly, or somebody who was out in that way. And I think now we're seeing more of that. But even then, and even now, I would say that the quote norm, and what I think most people expect of their kids when they grow up, is that they will end up, in being straight and in a heteronormative seeming relationship, where you just continue that nuclear family dynamic. It's been so programmed into us as a society. And so to think outside of that box, it takes a lot of inner this is not me, for that to actually come to the surface enough to make a change, enough to, you know, move the needle where you start to make decisions that say, I can't, this like, this is so not me. I can't do it. Right. And so I think that was a really big thing that held me back, because frankly, I wasn't having those scream pull ahs. Um, I I don't even know that because of my upbringing, and not just my upbringing, but the way that I was interacted with as a young kid, like from 6 basically all the way up to post-college years, I found it really challenging to be friends with girls because they were always at the center of my bullying experiences. And I talk a lot about this in my book. I have talked a little less about it on the podcast, actually, but that's a topic for another episode. But I was ruthlessly bullied from 6 to through high school, and then on and off in my college experiences. And frankly, even as an adult in my 20s, I've had bullying experiences, and every time it's been with women. And having that happen to me at such a young age, and especially a lot of my formative years being what I would qualify the worst experiences in that for me, I really stayed away from girls. And I would often feel deep hesitation to even get to know somebody, because I was so I just assumed that I was going to interact with them and it was going to be really, really negative. And so the idea of developing or even owning any potential attraction that I might have to women was just so off the table for me, because for me it was really more of like, will you be nice to me even, you know whereas I didn't have that experience with men or boys. And so when I was growing up, I was really close with my brother. We were like inseparable. And I ended up developing one best friend who was a girl, but it took a lot for us to be friends, and that was like, I mean, really, she was probably like my first partner if we're really thinking about how I now see love and how I now see relationships. And I think I always saw it that way. I just, didn't have the language for it. We weren't intimate or sexual in any way. She's still one of my best friends of all time, but we spoke on we'd spend all day at school together, and then we would get home and talk on the phone all night. And like, she was my person. She was my platonic life partner during a really, really important season of my life. But the idea of being attracted to women during that time of my life, it wasn't even something I could contemplate because of my upbringing. So that's, the second big thing for me is I just had really negative experiences with women, with girls. And it really tainted my ability to you put up a wall, you put up a security blanket, or you protect yourself. And damn, did I need to do that big time. And I had more positive interactions with men and boys. And I was always, kind of a little bit of a tomboy growing up. And I just really, really identified, I think, more with, I just also was never part of like the drama and the cattiness that in high school and college, a lot of my experience with women surrounded. And I just always gravitated to men. I always gravitated to the ease and a lot of the men that I was around, or the boys that I was around, were just really fun and playful, and didn't take things too seriously, but were also thoughtful and cerebral. And granted, there were always, the ones that weren't. I just didn't spend time with them as much. So that was really my experience. And because of that, I developed deeper connections with more men in my life. And boys, even as, my first, I'll never forget my first boyfriend, boyfriend in big quotations, because I was in, gosh, I think probably grade 3 or 3rd grade, as all you Americans say, but yeah. And him being my boyfriend just meant that he picked me first in gym class, and we would play basketball at recess together every single day. And like his mom made me like a scarf and hat set for Christmas. And his name was Colin. Colin, if you're listening, thank you for being such a lovely first boyfriend. I will never forget you. Too funny. A lot of my friends listening probably right now from that time of life are laughing so hard. Oh yeah, some people you just don't forget. Anyways, but yeah, I felt safer with men, which is interesting because I know a lot of women in my life, and probably a lot of you, feel the opposite. I have been really lucky to and grateful to have been connected to a lot of really, really wonderful humans, granted, frankly, in life, but especially men. I have just, I'm really grateful for that, and to have had that experience in my own story. So, for me, also identifying as demisexual, which is something actually I want to talk about too today, because a big part of my sexual identity isn't just being bisexual, which, for the record, does not mean that I'm just attracted to men or women. It means I'm attracted to all people. Bisexuality is, I know there's a term pansexuality, but really it does mean all genders, or all gender identities. It's an all umbrella like term for that. And certainly within the bisexuality spectrum, there can be a little bit of a difference. Or if you're talking or thinking about the Kinsey scale, which has issues, from my standpoint, I don't think it is all encompassing, but we vary in that space, right? Sexuality, I think, is a spectrum, and, some people are more, may identify as biromantic, aka I can build romantic relationships with multiple genders, but I don't feel sexually pulled to that. Or maybe the opposite, they can be sexually bisexual but not biromantic. So there's also that element. There's just so much nuance in this, and I love that shit. I live in the gray. It's the way that I like to be. But there's also been so much language attached to this stuff to be able to actually name it now, which is why I think we're starting to actually see so many more people step into the nuance of their sexualities, the nuance of their gender, because there's language for it now. And I'm so grateful for that. And so part of the language that I've learned for myself in the last few years is that I am deeply a demisexual. And what that means is that I do not build or feel pulled to want to interact with somebody in a sexual nature until I have developed a strong connection with that person. And that can look different depending on the human in question, right? Some people, it can take me a long time to build a strong connection with, months, years even. Other people, it feels almost instantaneous, like within a meeting experience that can happen. So it just really varies. But I highly recommend that if you're listening to that, you're like, oh, that feels like me, right? Again, there's nothing wrong with you to, like, I always used to think it was so weird of me that, like, I'd have some of my friends talk about one night stands and being so stoked about that experience. And I would always be like, oh, I don't understand it. And when I didn't understand something, I would make it wrong. And so for a long time, I never externally did it, but I slut shamed my people in my life. I was like, well, they're just a fucking slut and I'm not. Like, I'm all about relationships. I'm all about connection. And that's such a very, very, very small and totally incorrect way at lens of looking at that. And so certainly I was only looking at it from the lens that I knew and the lens that I had and the information I knew. But for me, because I didn't understand it, and it was so foreign to what I knew, and I knew that, like, that was what led to my connections building and my relationships building by taking things in a certain way and not having these one night stand experiences. I made them wrong. And we're just all different, and we're all made differently. And there is so much magic in having that experience and having one night stands. So I know so many people who love that experience and feel so liberated by that. And it just really, really, really allows them to embody their fullest selves. And that's incredible. And then other people who are more like demisexual like me, and so it's just really, really about who you are and understanding who you are at a deeper level. So that, I think that came up for me more recently. I figured that out about myself. But again, it was even from like and I remember like in high school, when I was really starting to feel pulled towards people in more of a sexual way. Um, it was always that I was always felt pulled towards men. And I also never felt pulled to any man that I didn't know deeply. I always was the girl who was falling in love with their best friend. It was just me. And ironically, this continued into my early adulthood and my 20s with women, but I didn't acknowledge that that's what was happening when it was actually happening. So we're going to get into that in a little bit, but yeah, I think for me, it was not acknowledging it until later was so wrapped up in my bullying experience and not feeling safe and secure because, again, my demisexuality, it literally, I need that experience. I need that in order to interact with somebody sexually or even feel pulled to interact with somebody sexually. So that was a big part of my story. And then, of course, the big and final one is that, I've had what I would qualify two big relationships in my life thus far. Ones that, and I'm talking intimate and romantic partners, not best friends, because again, I don't tend to separate these out personally, but right now we're talking about sexuality and, I haven't had sex with my best friends. Although, that's not exclusively true, but almost completely true. For a long time, those were separate from me. Now living in the poly space, they can be different if I want them to, but for the most part, they're platonic at this point. And that has been, my big relationships, my big romantic or should I say intimate relationships. The first one was almost a 3-year relationship with my ex-boyfriend that actually came on the podcast in June. I'll link the episode with him, with Wes, in the show notes for you. We talked so much about the Black experience because he is Black, and having a really open dialogue about race post all the George Floyd stuff. So if you're curious about that and want to learn more about my past, if you haven't already listened to that episode, you can totally rock that. But we were together for, I think I was 15 when we met, and it was he was the first like love of my life and first everything of my life, and then I think I had a year and a half in between our breakup and meeting my husband, Kevin, which you've obviously seen him all over my socials and also on the podcast. And so, we're about to hit our 10-year anniversary of being together. And that, I met him when I was 19 years old. So, he was one of those, initial, I didn't know him beforehand, so he was kind of an oddball in that way. But getting to know him on our first date, I felt like I had known him forever. And it's a feeling I haven't had since, and a feeling I will never forget. And I immediately felt that, security and that connection and that pull. It felt like a movie, and it happened to me with a man because, again, by that point, I felt safer with men. Even, my closest friends from college, are men. It's just, it's just been a big part of my journey. And so then that posed the entire, I didn't really think about my sexuality after that. Because I was always of the mindset that, okay, well, this is, again, monogamy was the way that I was programmed to believe was the only way. And I was, fine with that. I was like, okay, it's the only way, it's the way. And um, integrity and honesty are two of the most important values and pillars of the way that I live in my life. And so the concept of stepping outside of that, or even questioning that for myself, felt really, really, really outside of my own character and myself. So I just kind of turned it off, and that doesn't mean that I didn't acknowledge when somebody was attractive, but I didn't acknowledge my attraction, if that makes sense. And that's how I operated in the context of my relationship with, my husband for a really, really, really long time. I had a fuck off on my forehead every time we would go out, because I just was like, I've committed to this human. We are in a monogamous relationship, and that's just what it is. And, what I'm so grateful for is that I knew when I first met Kev that we would always grow together, that we would always have these huge, beautiful, open dialogues about who we are and what we want and our dreams, and, dig into the deep stuff that a lot of humans just, like, I know aren't really willing to go. And that was always the foundation of our relationship. And so when I started to uh, step into my body with a more healthy space, which, again, I talk about this in the article that I mentioned earlier that I did with Love What Matters. But with my history of eating disorder cycles, I was really disconnected from my body for a long time. So even acknowledging what turned me on was really, really hard, because I was just so at war with my body. And once I started that healing process in 2016, around 2017 is when I started having more fantasies about women. And, it's honestly, it started with watching Orange is the New Black, which was before that. But with Ruby Rose, I was like, oh, this human is so attractive. And I knew that I had attraction there. But again, it wasn't like something I felt like I was pulled to act on. And then when I started fantasizing, or started trying to heal, my relationship with my body in multiple ways by stepping into self-pleasure more, I noticed myself being a lot more attracted and pulled to thinking about women, reading about women, watching women. And, I would watch movies, and there would be, two lesbians in the movie, and I would find myself feeling incredible. Like I couldn't take my eyes off of it. And I brought this up to Kev, and, we talked about it really openly, and in a way of like, I don't know what this means, you know, because I, again, had been programmed from a very young age, as I think so many of us have been, to believe that bisexuality was just like a pathway to gay. And I think that narrative is changing a lot, but I also think it's still a big part of the narrative. I know many people who identify as bisexual and who talk about it openly, and who get really shamed by the queer community. Pick a side is a lot of, what we're told. Or if we are in a partnership, like for example, I have been in a partnership with my husband, Kevin, for 10 years. And so I get identified as straight all the time, even though I am the farthest thing from it. And it shouldn't take me having because I am polyamorous, I have, have the joy of being able to have multiple partners if I choose. I shouldn't have to have a, female identified partner and a male identified partner in order to be seen as bisexual. And I think a lot of you have probably, seen me on social and don't know, the intricacies of my other relationships. And probably just assume that if I do have any other partners that they are female identified. And, I would ask yourself about that, right? Because even for me, I know that I felt that early on in my coming, to, and my journey to coming out really, and owning my bisexuality as true for me and valid in general. 2017 was, it really was like a whole year and a half before I actually acted on my desire to step into that space. Took a lot of talking, a lot of um, self-reflection, and a lot of really attempting to pull back the shame for myself. I knew that I wanted to step into that space. And I talk about this with Kevin on the podcast we did around polyamory. I think it's episode 105. We'll be doing more, by the way. But also the episode where I came out as poly in episode 101, I talk about that for me, my first step into bisexuality and into having any sexual experience with a woman happened, what has it been now? Like middle of 2018. So, a little less than 3 years, 2.5 years. And that was, a year and a half into really seriously considering this, but really it was more like my early 20s when we were having these conversations, because of course you have conversations, or at least Kevin and I did, around what we're interested in and what fantasies we might have. And it always just felt like this faraway thing that I couldn't really own. And, as I've really owned my bisexuality, between just acknowledging it for myself that it is totally valid for me to be married to a man or in partnership with a man and be bisexual. And that is true for anybody, for anyone listening, whether you identify as polyamorous, monogamous, or somewhere in the middle. Your relationship status does not define your sexuality. Period. End of story. It does not define your sexuality. I have, like I said before, talked to so many of you who identify as female and are in a relationship with a male identified partner, and you question if, your bisexuality is even valid because you've chosen that. And it is so fucking valid. It is so fucking valid. Again, our relationship structure does not say anything about our sexuality. And I just want to remind you of that, because every part of you that makes you you is valid. Every part of you that makes you you is worthy and is worth celebrating. And you are such a beautiful and important part of the queer community. The nuance that is being a human is so beautiful and so worth reveling in from my standpoint. And that's what I do. That's for what I try and do every day for myself. And I also want to remind you that wherever you're at in your own experience of coming home to yourself, right, which is the theme of this month, with all the content I've been creating, and really the theme of what I do, it's all about coming home to your fuck yes self, right? And our sexuality and our relationships are a big part of that. Is a huge part of that, I would argue. Connection to self and touch and the way we experience pleasure and the way we experience love and connection and, yeah, it's such a beautiful part of who we are. And I hope that by listening to my story and hearing more about my own journey in this process, that you can own your own and acknowledge that, maybe one time 5 years ago, you thought you were developing a platonic relationship that maybe had romantic overtones with a woman, and she became your best friend because that's what you knew how to identify it as at the time. And when you look back now, you realize that really you were madly in love with her and you just didn't know how to put words to that. um, and you didn't have a sexual experience with her to know that that's true. Maybe that's you. Or maybe you are in a relationship with you are a woman who's in a relationship with a woman, and you find yourself really attracted to this bartender that granted we're all in COVID times, but this is just hypothetical, a bartender that you talk to, and you develop this really strong connection with him emotionally, and feel yourself feeling pulled towards interacting with him in a sexual way, right? We all live somewhere on the sexuality spectrum. And interestingly enough for me, I think I land pretty in the middle, but I still have tendencies to feel more safe and secure around men than women. And so because of that, I find I have a harder time allowing myself to feel safe and open and seen with another woman. And that I tend to put deeper walls up in that exchange earlier on. And so my options tend to gravitate more towards men, frankly, where I develop more of my relationship with that. That has shifted in the last few years because, generally speaking, just because I have so much more self-awareness and worth and confidence in myself. And if I interact in a toxic way with a woman, which happens still more than I would like, can we just be nice to each other? I don't understand. I don't understand that. I never will. But I also have connected with so many incredible women who are truly, truly some of the most amazing humans I've ever come to know. And those experiences have really allowed me to soften in that space, between knowing them and also being more confident in myself. Which I think also allowed me to step into my bisexuality with intention, and into polyamory with intention as a result. So, I'm really grateful for that. I'm really grateful for the constant unraveling and unbecoming of all of the shoulds and all of the things that I didn't think would ever be for me, because they weren't they were outside of the black and white box that the world had decided for me, or that I had decided for myself. And hell, if I live in the black and white, I will always live in the gray. So it's been a really beautiful journey of coming home to me, really. And I wouldn't trade it for the world. And I hope that wherever you are in your journey, that you can use this time as you're listening to this to reflect on maybe what are the things that stood in my way, whether you know where you're at within your sexuality or not. What are the things that have created a narrative in my mind around a gender? How do I interact with women? How do I interact with men? How do I interact with trans humans, and why? Like, where do I fall on that space? Why do I feel so pulled towards men, but the idea of women and interacting with anyone non-binary is not something for me. how is that partly because I've been programmed that way, or is that really how I feel? Curiosity. That is the way that we can really start to peel back the layer, and the layer of the onion that is us, as I always say, and really get to the root of who we are. Curiosity is your best friend, and it has been mine, and I'm so grateful for it. I'm so grateful for all of the experiences and all the humans that have come into my life that have allowed me to dig deeper in that space. So yeah, that's my coming out experience. And I will be answering questions in a deeper way around this inside of my Patreon, my Facebook community on there. So please, 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 if you're not already in there, you can hop on, like I said before, in patreon.com, patreon.com/live your fuck yes life. It's also in the show notes for you all. We always do a deeper dive of the podcast episode each week in there, and really, really get into your nitty gritty questions uncensored, because there's some things you just can't talk about online. So I'm excited to do that with you all. And I'm just so grateful for all of you, however you identify in this community. You are valid, and whatever your relationship structure looks like. And if your sexuality maybe is different than that, again, you are so fucking valid and worthy, and you are seen, and I am right there with you. So I'm really excited for next week's episode. Every year on my on my birthday, I always do a look back on the year. I'm doing something a little bit different as I roll into 30. It's going to be dropping on my 30th birthday, 30 in quarantine, not how I expected to spend this birthday. So yeah, it's going to be a good one. Thank you always. Remember, if you are here, to subscribe, rate and review on iTunes and all that good stuff. It really does help get the podcast in front of more eyeballs and earballs. And yeah, as always, I'll see you on the interwebs and in the Patreon. And until next week, I'll see you on the flip side. Bye-bye.